9th of November, the year of our Lord, 1938, violence against the Jews broke out across the Reich. In just 2 days, over 250 synagogues were burned, and over 7,000 Jewish businesses, hospitals, cemeteries, and schools were looted. Dozens of Jews were killed. This was Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, so named after the shards of shop windows that littered the streets in its wake. Following this display of violence, the German government sought to unload its Jewish problem onto other countries.
In 2 days, more than 250 synagogues were burned down. Over 7,000 business establishments owned by Jews were attacked, and many Jews were killed. It truly was a terrible time for the Jewish community. Fortunately, Lottie and her family had not stayed long enough to experience this. And Margot, although she and her family were left in Germany, she had something positive to look forward to amidst the chaos. It was seeing Lottie again.
What did you feel exactly when you were told that you were going to this place called the Philippines?
Only joy, because I was going to be reunited with Lottie. But you heard about such things in conversations that children overheard of their grown-ups talk about. And you knew that there was something uncertain. Lottie's father and mother decided to go, so they left for the Philippines a month before we did. It's something that, my parents repeated, that you will see Lottie again when we get to the Philippines. They gave us a goodbye party. And at that goodbye party, the cousins of my father were kind of making fun of us and saying, "You're going to a country where elephants and tigers are walking in the streets. How can you do a thing like that?" And when I heard that, I thought that could only be fun in my mind. You must remember that the Philippines were totally unknown in those circles in Germany, and it was like going to the moon. You don't know what's going to be and what you're to be expected.
And the trip was a 1-month-long trip. It began, we had to go to France, and from Paris we went to Marseille. From Marseille we took the ship, and the ship went from Egypt. From Egypt we went to Djibouti, and I remember the Buddhas frightened me terribly. And from Djibouti we went to Sri Lanka. And my mother looked at that uncivilized area there, and she was afraid that's where we were going to. From Sri Lanka, we went to Singapore. From Singapore, we went to Saigon. Then we changed ships to a British ship. And then from the British ship in Hong Kong, we went to Manila. We felt relieved because we knew that we would be rid of Hitler. And we knew not very little about the Philippines.
Although it was probably not the same for the grown-ups, Margot's fear was somehow replaced with excitement as she realized the adventure that was ahead of her. And more importantly, she anticipated being with Lottie again. But moving further into this so-called adventure, Margot saw a whole bigger world beyond her tiny comfort zone of play. They were faced with complications. They have been to places, and they have come across many different people, but none of them was Lottie. Young Margot could not help but wonder, will they ever see each other again?
Little by little, and I saw my mother's tears. By that time, I realized that my parents were counting their pennies very seriously. We were standing at the port, ready to go on ship, and they called the names of the families. Our name wasn't called. So my father went and said, what happened? You know, this is Seoul Castle, and I see our boxes are still standing at the port. What's going on? Oh, it had been a mistake. And so the ship lowered this huge net, and very quickly they threw the boxes into the net, and the crane smashed against the side of the ship. At that point, my mom broke into tears and said, "Nothing that we packed will come in one piece." And that I felt and I understood. It was terrible.
Despite the long and difficult journey, Margot took her strength from her parents.
It was a smooth ship, you know, in those days. It was a French liner. It was 4 weeks. It was a long trip.
And although taken to many unfamiliar places and situations, she found comfort in their wholeness as a family, most especially when she had an incident that had made her appreciate this more.
I know one incident that there was a young boy. I was 7 and this boy was 8. And this boy traveled alone. And his parents had sent him away from Germany by himself on the ship, and he landed in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And I remember my mother being shocked that parents would send a child alone, but that was the way they were going to save their child.
And here is arriving in the Philippines, my brother and my dad and my mother and I arriving in Manila. My parents were so optimistic about being able to get away and get away very far away where they would be out of the clutches of Hitler. That was kind of most encouraging.
When the ship comes to a stop, all the people go to the rails and so forth. And I, of course, was very impatient because I knew that Lottie was at the port with her family. And finally it came our turn and we came down.
And we went to the pier to meet them, and that was quite a reunion.
And yes, there was Lottie and the family.
And I was telling her, this is a terrific country.
Lottie grabbed my hand and said, "It's so exciting, it's so exciting. We live near the ocean, and I will take you to the ocean."
You go to the beach every day, you can pick up shells, you can go swimming.
Now, this is the first picture in the Philippines.
What do you remember from that photo?
Nothing except that this dress I loved, and my parents bought it before we left Germany. We were living, as I said, on Porvenir Street.
This was our house on Progreso Street. Got there, my parents and I.
This was my introduction to the Philippines, which was something very, very exciting for our age.
Bahay kubo kahit munti, ang halaman doon ay sari-sari, singkamas at talong, sigadilya at mani, sitaw patani.
A few years after Margot and Lottie had arrived and reunited in Manila, more and more Jewish families had followed and escaped from the worsening horrors in Nazi-occupied territories in Europe. Among them are the Weislers, including Max.
Magandang nyo. Pasensya na lang. Ang pangalan ko Max Weisler, tiga-Alemanya ako. Lumaki ako sa Manila. I live with my aunt in a city called Breslau, and there I went to a Jewish school. My parents, they had a store but it went back and bad, so they sold it, or they had to give it back, and they went on bicycle from place to place selling underwear. Relations with my parents were not so good. They were arguing, and I had to squeeze between. That's how I grew up.
No matter how young a child is, he is forced to mature beyond his age when circumstances ask for it. And it was really quite a circumstance that awaited Max and his family then.
One day, my aunt got a telegram or something from my parents that my father will be arrested if we don't leave the country by the Gestapo. So my father, overnight, he had a valid passport. He went to Denmark. My mother took me, and we also went to Copenhagen to be with my father. We followed a few days later. So in Denmark, we were so-called tourists, but actually we were refugees from Germany, which the police found out. So they wanted to deport my father or all of us back to Germany. He went to the American embassy and he asked for a visa to any country that will accept him. So maybe he went to the American embassy, he asked for a visa to the Philippines. But unfortunately, they didn't have the stamp, the Philippines. So they gave him a valid, permanent entry visa. I have a copy here to the United States. But him, instead of going to the United States, he took a ship going to the Philippines. So anyway, my father came in, and then we followed him through. The war already broke out. The Suez Canal was closed. So we went to the Philippines by way of Russia, Manchuria, Japan, and we finally made it to Manila. It was about 2 weeks, and we had nothing to eat. So we had the thermos bottle. We asked from the wagon to give us hot water to make tea. It's only me and my mother. I did not wash myself for about 2 weeks.
At a very young age, Max understood what a difficult life meant and what it was like to live it. However, it was also his innocence that got him through it.
And that is how we got to the Philippines. Is that part interesting?
Yes, very interesting. Yes.
There followed 30 years of hard work in nation building, when the structure of a democratic and independent nation was fashioned step by step. The Philippine Commonwealth, the first great stride toward full nationhood, was inaugurated in 1935. Manuel Quezon, fiery...
So Max, how much of your identity, if you would measure, is Filipino?
90%. Because I had my youth there. I grew up there. I learned my language there. Everything. The kids accepted me. Ikaw na lang ang puti sa amin. So they used to call me Mestizo Bangus, Madali na Obus.
We played sipa, loved playing sipa, and we had jacks. And then I forget what the name of it is. You drew these squares on the floor, and you jump hopscotch. That was a great, also a great game. And you don't have to wear any shoes. You can wear these wooden bakyas.
The next thing I think that I loved were chinelas. They don't have chinelas like we used to have. Chinela was made out of hemp and beautifully decorated with colorful little pearls.
My mother used to make a living. She started to bake muffins from old bananas, partly malambut na. And then my mother, with my father, started to make pies. We had no wheat flour, only cassava.
When we had breakfast, there was this beautiful, huge papaya with a piece of calamansi on it. And it was just the most wonderful thing I'd ever eaten. I couldn't believe that a melon, you know, that my mother kept saying it's a melon, but how could a melon be so big? Well, I personally experienced, I think, most of it as a child in school, that when the Filipinos children could afford to buy hamburgers, we couldn't. We brought our own little sandwiches. And then the Filipinos would say, taste it here, and they would share their own lunches with us, which was tremendously generous from them. And these people were our neighbors in the Philippines, that's family. Here I am with Lottie. And the same thing when they brought desserts or cakes like ensaimadas. And again, they shared. It was sharing their very food that they were having for their own meals, which was tremendously important.
I was one of the children. All my friends there were Filipinos, and they were ako na lang ang puti diyan. So I was something new for them. We slept with mosquito nets.
They explained to me why I had to be careful to tuck it in and not let mosquitoes in and so forth.
Yeah, well, it was quite warm. We were not used to that. But at the same time, I liked the fact that you didn't have to wear much clothing. We loved this. We loved Philippine Women's University. We had Miss Osorio, who was the principal. Mrs. Benitez was the president of the school. And Ms. Manzo was our homeroom teacher. I still remember all those names.
Practically, I had no schooling in the Philippines. I went to school, but I did not know the material. But it was new for me in English, and they were much more advanced in math and other things, which I never got to.
Well, the Filipino people are exceedingly friendly. They're very, very musical. They all have pretty good voices. And we learned the Filipino dances. We learned Filipino songs. And we had a toy orchestra, I remember, at Philippine Women's University.
I told you, my father said he would bring the first ship in with goods, and you can see how crowded the store is. This is in the Philippines.
Where is this exactly in the
On Escolta.
I was like what you call, canto boy. You know, one that runs around the streets. And I was one of them. And I think I spoke Tagalog well with everybody. I spoke Tagalog before I knew English. And with my parents, I spoke German.
It was just a happy, warm childhood. It was paradise in many ways because we were free. The Filipino children were very accepting.
Not one among these 3 children knew exactly what they were running from until they reached their stop. They finally knew what was missing. They finally understood what was wrong. They finally realized what fear does, to live with it and to finally live without it. They finally understood what refuge meant.
Your experience in the Philippines.
My identity, I grew up with the Filipinos. Pareho naman kami. I ate with them, I worked, I get paid, and I run around with them, the children.
All I can say is that until the war broke out, this was a perfectly normal, happy childhood.
Those morale-boosting efforts had to meet new
It was towards the end of 1941 when the Japanese attacked areas in Manila and its neighboring provinces, such as Pampanga, where the Americans held its Clark Air Base. In an effort to save it from further destruction, Manila was then declared an open city.
The Japanese decided to go to war with the United States.
5 years away from its promised appointment with freedom, the Philippine Commonwealth was plunged into war.
We were out for a walk on Dewey Boulevard when the Death March took place.
Manilaners on Bataan. The Death March.
They took the American and the Filipino soldiers and marched them to take them to Bataan and Corregidor.
I was standing on Dewey Boulevard, and I saw column of like soldiers. But when they came nearer, I saw that they were prisoners that came by boat to near Cavite. I forgot the name of the place. And from there, they marched them through Manila, through Fort Santiago, that were still alive from the marching, and to concentration camp.
Mrs. Benitez spoke to us and told us to be courageous and that we should go home and that as soon as possible the school will close immediately because of the attack of the Japanese.
After 2 years, it closed down. It could no longer, there was no schooling of any kind.
The Philippines became a target for Japan because remember, Japan wanted to target the Southeast Asian nations actually below us, specifically oil in the Dutch East Indies, tin and rubber in Malaysia. We're along the way. And it all did not help, of course, we're an American colony, so we became a target.
Then the Japanese came in. When I told them I'm Jewish, they did not know what a Jew is. So I told them I'm a German.
The fate of the Manilaners during the Japanese occupation was a very interesting thing because they had been stripped of their citizenship, their German citizenship, their Austrian citizenship, their Polish citizenship, and yet they had expired passports. And many of these expired passports had the big red J on it, indicating that they were Jews. But the Japanese were allies of the Germans. And so those Manilaners who had even expired passports or passports with the red J on it, noting that they were Jews, they were not considered enemies by the Japanese.
But then the biggest problem of Jews was, I guess, hunger.
Life before the war, free enterprise, freedom of movement, freedom of residence, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. When the Japanese came in, all of that was taken out. Movement of people, limited. You have to stay in your place. Press, controlled. Censorship, all media controlled. Nothing anti-Japanese, everything anti-American. Basic resources, controlled. Everything was rationed. Rice has to be rationed. food, everything. So it was a militarized, controlled economy. No freedoms. So Filipinos felt that very badly. And how did the Jews experience it? Same thing. Fortunately for the Jews, the Japanese did not take the anti-Semitist policy of the Germans seriously.
During this time, President Manuel Quezon and his family were evacuated to Corregidor. But when the Japanese bombed their location as well, they flew to the US and ran the government in exile.
But the worst part took place at the end of the war.
That became a very fearful time.
It was terrible. But for a child, you know, you just go through.
There isn't a question of being Jewish or not Jewish. All of us went through a terrible period of suffering. But the same, but not because we were Jewish. That's a very important difference. Our lives were equal to those of the Filipinos under the war.
Trouble seemed to follow Margot, Lottie, and Max. But what did it really mean for these three children to witness their paradise, their huge friendly playground, being turned into a battleground?